Welcome to the third lecture of Religion 3367, Islamic Faith and Society, or Islam, Faith and Society. Today we are going to talk about the immediate historical, geographical, and linguistic background and context just prior to the event of Islam, the emergence of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. So we have to talk about Arabia. That is the contents of chapter 2 of this book, which is simply entitled Arabia. And then we will, maybe in this same lecture, if it gets too long, I'll split it into two smaller pieces. We will then get into chapter 3, the pre-Islamic Near East. These are all necessary preliminaries before we embark upon our study of Islam proper with the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, which is the topic of chapter 4. And that will then lead into the discussion in the next chapter, chapter 5 of the Quran, and then the chapter thereafter of the Hadith. I spoke briefly about Quran and Hadith in the previous lecture, namely lecture 2. So there are a number of important facts to understand about Arabia. Arabia, in the century just before Islam, was, as it is now, an arid desert wasteland. That is the majority of what the Arabian Peninsula represents in terms of land area. So if you look at the map, which in the printed version of the book is on page 20, you see how the Arabian Peninsula is situated between Africa and Asia proper. I mean, strictly speaking, the Arabian Peninsula is a part of Asia, but it is kind of nicely nestled between Africa and, in fact, mainly what is today the country of Egypt. There's also Sudan. I think that would be Ethiopia, Somalia, maybe Eritrea, Djibouti. And then on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, you basically have Iran and a piece of Iraq, maybe. Yeah. In terms of the modern nations of Iran and Iraq. And so the whole Arabian Peninsula is, as the author describes it, something sort of like an axe, I think he says. A great axe blade. An interesting image. But if you look at the map, you see something. You see a region in capital letters, the An-Nafud or Al-Nafud. The L is actually not pronounced. That is a vast desert tract. Then lower down, you have also in capital letters, Rub' al-Khali. That means the empty quarter, and in some maps, it'll actually say the empty quarter. And the word Rub' al-Khali literally means, the term Rub' al-Khali literally means in Arabic, the empty quarter. That's also a vast desert wasteland. And when I say a vast desert wasteland, I mean sand dunes. There's really not a lot of rocky outcroppings or anything like this. And the rest of Arabia does have some other sort of geographic features, these really rugged sort of hills that are really geologically the remains of lava flows and eruptions, probably in remote geological eras of volcanoes. And on the western coastline is a region called the Hijaz, which is kind of flat. And it's in the Hijaz, flat in some parts and then dotted by these kind of mountains and lava flows. And it is there that you find in the Hijaz the town of Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad is born. Then further north, you will find on this map what is written as Yathrib, and then in parentheses it says Medina, That's the city to which the Prophet Muhammad migrated. Yathrib is the old and ancient name. And above, slightly above Yathrib to the north, you see Khaybar. Khaybar is an important fortress garrison town, which was a Jewish town. And we will have more to say about that later when we talk about the different religious groups that existed prior to the emergence of Islam. So what I'd like to call your attention to in this map is that this region is all very dry. The very arid, almost no rainfall ever. You could go years without rain. There are, of course, oases. There are certain pockets and little dotted areas where there is a source of underground water. So Najran is a famous one, which is shown there. Medina is another one. There are wells in Medina. But the southernmost part of Arabia, and especially also a part of Oman as well, what is today the nation of Oman. But here in the ancient times in Arabia, that whole region of Oman and Yemen was known as Al-Ahqaf and is referred to as such in the Quran. Those regions, the Yemen, what is today Yemen, and Oman, do receive sufficient rainfall due to the monsoon so that a certain kind of rain-based agriculture is possible, meaning that you can trap this sort of rainwater, and on the basis of that, you can have some sort of freshwater irrigation. And so it is in those regions that a settled kind of sedentary environment and civilization emerged, which also had some works of architecture, but not at all as monumental as what you found in ancient Egypt or in ancient Babylon. As for the more desert regions to the north, you had very little settlement or sedentary life. You had sedentary life in Mecca, and then there's another city which you can see on the map that says At-Ta'if or Al-Ta'if, A-L, but again the L is silent. At-Ta'if is how it's pronounced. That is a town in at a high altitude, a mountainous region, and that is still there. So you had a settlement there. So you had these little dotted settlements, and in between, basically, you had people who were nomads, and they practiced animal husbandry. You know, they would raise goats, and of course, they had camels, they had horses, and their diet was very basic. It consisted of whatever milk they would get from the camels. Occasionally, they would slaughter the camels. Of course, they would slaughter the sheep. There's very little, by way of grazing. There was dates, and life was very, very simple. So this is the kind of geographical conditions that you found in Arabia, and you would have found very much into modern times as well, until the discovery of oil in that region, which was both a blessing, I would say, as well as a curse. But that is another story. So the Arabs did not really have or leave behind, as I said earlier, some kind of monumental architecture, some sort of grand inscriptions like the hieroglyphics in ancient Egypt. In South Arabia, you do find certain very basic inscriptions left behind on architectural ruins, which are nowhere as impressive as anything in ancient Egypt. And they are written in an ancient form of Arabic, which isn't used today, and in a writing system which is not used today either. Scholars refer to the writing system as epigraphic South Arabian, and modern scholars classify the various languages that are attested in these inscriptions as, they go by various names like Sabaiyan, Qatabaniyan. Those are two that come to mind. So Sabaiyan is basically, Saba is the Arabic word for Sheba, and it's associated with the Queen of Sheba. excuse me. In the more northern regions, there was a different kind of Arabic. So in southern Arabia, Yemen, Oman region, you would have some sort of group of Arabic languages actually at the time, which would have been called, which we would classify as Southern Arabic. And then in the north, you would have something called Northern Arabic. And again, you really don't find any kind of inscriptions. And or actually you do, but they're very, very small number of them, pre-Islamic inscriptions. Anyway, that's a whole subject in its right and in its own right, and I don't really want to go into that, and I may commit some grievous errors if I do, because it's a very specialized area and I'm not an expert on that. But our ancient Arabian society was very much organized by tribe. It was a tribal society, even in the south, where they did have settled sedentary life, but the Arabs were very, very interested in tribe. And you have to understand that a tribe is nothing but a large extended family. And the great cultural product of the Arabs was their language. Now, before Islam, there were a number of different Arabic languages, or we might call them Arabic dialects. And we know this because of the literature which was recorded in those languages, namely, by literature, I mean Arabic poetry. So poetry played an extremely important role in ancient Arabian tribal life, and the Arabic language was considered the great pride and great cultural achievement of the ancient Arabs. And so in this textbook there, he talks at length about pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, and he quotes some translations, but it doesn't really do justice. The poetry of pre-Islamic Arabia is really, to this day, considered to be the highest literary achievement of the Arabs. You might say, well, what about the Quran? Yes, the Quran is also considered a literary achievement, but other than, the majority of Arabs are Muslims, and therefore they consider the Quran not to be a work of the human genius of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, but a divine revelation. And even in the secular regimes that exist in the Arab world, the Quran is never treated as a kind of work of Arabic literature. So pre-Islamic Arabic poetry is considered to be the pinnacle of Arabic literature. Arabic poetry traditionally, and certainly the pre-Islamic poetry, and the poetry that even comes after it, is characterized by rhyme and meter, both. So rhyme, I think, is understood by most people, but meter means that there's certain set syllables in each line. And the poetry has a kind of even mathematical structure in that regard, and it has a certain kind of beat to it. So I'll just recite a few lines so you can get an idea. The most famous Arabic poem of the pre-Islamic world begins like this. قفا نبكي من ذكرى حبيب ومنزلي بسقط اللوى بين الدخول فحوملي فتوضح فالمقرات لم يعفر اسمها لما نسجتها من جنوب وشمألي. And it goes like that. So the poet is saying in the first line, قفا نبكي من ذكرى حبيب ومنزلي. He says, stop, to his traveling companions. You have to imagine a sort of desert caravan, these guys going through the desert, and he says, stop, O my companions, and let us weep. قفا نبكي من ذكرى حبيب, and let us weep in remembrance of a beloved whom we last, crossed paths with in a place called Siqt al-Liwa, between Siqt al-Liwa and Hawmali, two places. And it goes like that. So in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, you always have the poem opening with lines in lamentation and in remembrance for the lost beloved. You have to remember that these tribes would move through the desert, and they would move from place to place, not staying in any one place for a very long time, and so they would be separated. And so the person might become separated from his beloved, and so he would remember her and recite these kind of poems in her remembrance. And in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, in these ancient poems, which were called odes, or qasaid, or in Arabic is the plural, or qasida is the singular. These poems would be a few hundred lines long, so they're not really huge, like maybe something like the Odyssey of Homer or the Iliad of Homer in the Western tradition. Those are, of course, in ancient Greek. But, you know, they're 100 or 120, 140, 150, 200 line poems. And the pre-Islamic poets would also praise their tribe. They would praise their own acts of generosity or heroism on the field of battle. They would sometimes describe scenes quite beautifully of nature, of animals which they would encounter in the desert, of the landscape, of the movements of their horse, for example, and things like this. At the same time, the poet in pre-Islamic Arabia had almost a kind of ritual or religious function. And the word for poet in Arabic is shāʿir, and the word for poetry is shi'r. Shāʿir means poet, that's how we translate it, but literally in Arabic, it means someone who has shu'ur, someone who has a deep consciousness and a deep intuitive awareness of the nature of things, of the nature of human life, and therefore has a deep insight into human existence and is able to express that in the most beautiful, rhymed, and mathematically precise language. So poets were very, very highly regarded. The Arabs very much valued their language. Now you might say, well, there are all these different dialects. This is true. And in fact, the word that would be used in Arabic is the word that we now use for language rather than dialect. So there would be the language of such and such a tribe. And there were differences, important grammatical differences and usages. Again, you could imagine that like the different dialects which we find, the different way people talk in the United States of America. You can tell how, or the English language, I mean, there's differences in pronunciation and usage. So someone from Britain will speak a certain way, someone from Australia, someone from New Zealand, and someone from the United States or Canada. Then even within the US, you know, someone from Boston will speak in a different way than maybe someone from the San Francisco Bay Area or someone from El Paso, Texas. And I think you get the idea. But there is a kind of standard English, I suppose you could say. So similarly, there was a kind of standard Arabic. And the greatest poems were composed in this sort of common language, which was called the Fusha, al-Fusha, meaning the clear speech. And today the word Fusha just means classical Arabic. It means the kind of Arabic that you would hear on a news broadcast. Or would be written in a book or a newspaper, as opposed to the slang language that you would find in much less formal situations. So pre-Islamic Arabic poetry is extremely, extremely important. There's some, other headings and so forth here in the chapter, which you can just read. I don't really want to comment on them. I think they're pretty self-explanatory. I'd like to offer you things which are actually not in the book, add to the value of what you read there. Arab religion. So this is obviously something very important, because this is, of course, on the Islamic religion. So it's important to understand what was the religious climate among Arabs before the emergence of Islam. And here I think Daniel Brown doesn't really do a great job. He talks about pre-Islamic idolatry. And you have to understand that the Arabs before Islam did not have any sort of a historical record. It's true that in the poetry, of various tribes, of various tribal poets. The exploits of the tribe may indeed have been immortalized, their exploits in particular on the field of battle. And that was about as close to any kind of history that you would find. So a historical tradition, an historiographical tradition, that is to say, a tradition of writing history, doesn't really emerge until after Islam. And there's a very important historian who Daniel Brown mentions, named Ibn al-Kalbi, who wrote an extremely important book called the Book of Idols about pre-Islamic Arabian idolatry. Of course, Ibn al-Kalbi is writing as a Muslim. In fact, he was a Shia Muslim. He also was very interested in genealogy. I told you how important tribe was. And he, in fact, has a book on the genealogy of horses. The Arabs very much prized their horses. So the point which I would like to make is that Ibn al-Kalbi, talks about how idolatry really emerged in Arabia. Notice I said emerged. So what was there before? Well, according to Ibn al-Kalbi, there was a monotheistic faith. Now, Daniel Brown doesn't really emphasize that. And this is where we get into an area on which the adherents of different religions are not going to agree. And we get into an area where particularly secular-minded, scientific, historical, positivist type historians are not going to like it. The Arab historical tradition has always maintained that there are different kinds of Arabs. So what I mean by different kinds is in terms of their tribal origins. So the Arab historical and genealogical tradition speaks of the Arabs who are now extinct Arab tribes. Those are called in Arabic al-Arabul Ba'ida, which simply means the extinct Arabs. These were people in remote historical epochs who now do not exist. And in fact, the Arab historical tradition speaks of them being destroyed by God for their iniquities. And some of these groups are mentioned in the Quran, such as Ad. There was a tribe called Ad. It's hard to pronounce in English. It's just written A-D. And before the A, they put like a little superscript C for that that kind of gagging sound, which you find in Semitic languages. Another tribe, another Arab people, which was annihilated by God, punished by God, was the Thamud. So they no longer exist. And then there were those Arab tribes that remained, and they always maintained that the oldest Arab tribes came from southern Arabia, from the Yemen, Oman region, what the Quran calls al-Ahqaf, and they would migrate. There was a kind of Bedouinization, because if the rains would fail or something, then you don't have agriculture. There was also a very famous dam called the Ma'rib Dam, which burst and devastated civilization in the just prior to Islam, and it is mentioned in pre-Islamic poetry. And so various tribes would move out, and those tribes, in other words, the tribes that were indigenous to Arabia, were known as al-Arabul Ariba, which you could probably translate as the pure Arabs or the wandering Arabs, or it's really the indigenous, yes, I would say the indigenous inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula who were not destroyed. Now then you have another class of Arabs. They are called al-Arab al-Musta'riba. The Arabs who actually were not indigenous to the region. They came from outside and Arabized themselves. What does it mean to Arabize? It means to take on the language. Again, the language is fundamental for the Arabs. Who are these Arabs who came from outside and took on the Arabic language and the Arabic way of life? They are claimed by the Arab historical tradition, mentioned in the Quran as well, as being the descendants of Abraham, the prophet Ibrahim in Arabic, through his son Ismail, or in the Hebraic tradition, in the Mosaic tradition, in the Hebrew Bible, he's referred to as Yishmael, and in English, Ishmael. And he is the firstborn of the prophet Ibrahim or Abraham. Muslims recognize prophets before the Prophet Muhammad. The Prophet Muhammad is considered by Muslims to be the last and final messenger of God. And they believe that every human civilization, not even civilization, every human community, every human collectivity throughout time has always received some sort of guidance from God in the form of a messenger who would bring them a teaching and some sort of a law, some kind of a scripture. It says in the Quran, وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ, and to every human collectivity or community, there is a prophet. In other words, God is saying here in the Quran that he has sent a prophet to every human community. This is what Muslims believe that the Quran, that God is saying to them in the Quran, saying to humanity in the Quran. And so they accept the prophets of the past, and they accept that they brought revelations. So they accept Moses or Musa as a prophet, and that he brought a book and a law to the children of Israel, Banu Israel in Arabic. The children of Israel means the children of Jacob. Jacob is also known as Yisrael in the Torah, if you know your Bible. So Muslims would accept the Torah. They would accept that there was a figure named Jesus and that he had a revelation, and that revelation in Arabic is called Al-Injil. In English, that would be the Evangel. Now, the difference, of course, is that Muslims have a belief in an uncompromising and absolute monotheism, so they don't accept the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. They believe that Jesus was simply a man and a prophet, although he was miraculously conceived without any male intervention. That story is there in the Quran. So the Arab historical tradition maintains, and the Quran also maintains, that Ibrahim brought his son Ishmael, with his mother Hajar or Hagar to Mecca. And he left them there with a small amount of water. And he did this because he was commanded to do so by God. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Genesis, so the Torah consists of 5 books. It's also referred to as the Pentateuch. This is the wrong volume, need volume 1. So in the book of Genesis, the story is told in should be Genesis chapter 16, and then further on in Genesis chapter 21, the story is told. And I mean, I'm not going to recite it. You can refer to the Bible. It's very easy nowadays. You can go on the internet and just type in those chapters and you can read the story. So the Bible tells a different story. The Pentateuch or the Torah tells us a different story, in which of course Abraham is married to 2 women. There's his Sarah, and then there's Hagar, then he marries her, and he has a child by her before he has the child Isaac by Sarah. These are rather well-known stories for Christians and Jews, and that there's the 2 women don't get along, and it's for this reason that he removes his wife Hagar or Hajar from the domestic situation, shall we say, and takes her elsewhere. But it doesn't say where he takes her. In one place in the biblical account, which would be yes, Genesis 16, you have an account there where Hagar is in a state of sort of consternation about this, and the status of her son Ishmael and the problems with Sarah. and she betakes herself to a place and weeps there, and then God hears her or sees her, and that place is referred to as, it's just transliterated in the King James version and other versions as Bir Lahai Roy, which is Be'er Lahai Ra'i in Hebrew, which means the well of the ever living who seeth me, or who sees me. So in the Muslim account, the place is Mecca. Abraham leaves them there with a certain amount of water. In most older translations of the Bible, it says he left him with a bottle of water. And this is ridiculous, man. I mean, it wasn't like a bottle of Dasani or Evian or something, you know, the smart water, or even like a glass bottle. These people who translated this were sitting in England writing the King James version. They've never been to the desert. You don't carry a bottle of water in ancient times in the desert. You carry a water skin. At any rate, the water skin became depleted. And then Hajar did not know what to do. And she runs to a hillock and then looks back to see if her infant child is all right. And then she runs to another hillock looking for water in between. And these are the hills of Safa and Marwa, according to Muslim belief, in Mecca to this day. In Genesis 21, and there seems to be some chronological problem here, because, you know, it comes after, that 21 comes after, Genesis 21 comes after the birth of Ishmael. And yet it talks about there, oh, lift up the lad. I mean, she can't be lifting up a 13-year-old child. Anyhow, and so then, you know, a well comes forth, and then it says that Ishmael grew and lived in the land, and he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran. Now, Paran or Faran in Hebrew, Faran is also an ancient name for the environs of Mecca. So this is also very, very interesting. Anyhow, this is what Arab historical tradition claims. And so Ibrahim leaves his family there. And in the Quran, before he leaves, he prays to God to raise up a prophet amongst them. And of course, to provide for their means and their sustenance and so forth. Excuse me. And then later he comes back, and it is there that they raise the edifice of the Kaaba. So the Kaaba, this cubical structure in Mecca around which Muslims walk around in a ritual form of worship called tawaf, which they do during the pilgrimage to Mecca. And there's two kinds of pilgrimage, the lesser and the greater. And it is to that directional marker, if you're in Mecca, that you pray toward. And of course, if you're not in Mecca, if you're in Miami, you pray toward Mecca. But if you're in the city of Mecca, or if you're in the Grand Mosque of Mecca, you just pray towards this cubic structure called the Kaaba. It's very famous. If you Google it, you can see it's a black, covered with a black kind of cloth. And so Muslims believe that this structure was already there. It had been there, originally built by Adam, as attested in certain hadiths and other Arab historical writings, historical tradition, which was recorded after Islam. And that it is actually Ibrahim who instituted the rites of the pilgrimage. Okay, so this is what is relevant for the class. I'm sorry I put in a lot of detail there, but it's kind of necessary. And it is known that the pre-Islamic Arabs maintained the sanctity of Mecca, and they would come to Mecca, and they would come there once a year at least for a pilgrimage. And that pilgrimage involved walking around the Kaaba. And they did this in honor of and in remembrance of the rite of walking around, which in fancy English is called circumambulation, which just means walking in a circle, which was originally instituted by Abraham and Ishmael. And both of them are regarded as prophets. Moreover, later, Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his only son. Muslims maintain that that was Ishmael, not Isaac. So as and that the place where this took place was Mecca. So you can see that there are very important differences regarding this question Christians and Jews maintain that this took place on Mount Moriah in what is today Jerusalem, and that the individual in question was Isaac, and that the individual in question, as also in the Muslim account, was replaced miraculously by a ram. And anyhow, the pre-Islamic Arabs maintained a pilgrimage to this site. And this was the state of affairs at the time of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad as well. And Ibn al-Kalbi, remember the Shiite historian I talked about who wrote a book on pre-Islamic Arab religion called the Book of Idols, Kitab al-Asnam? It's the title in Arabic. It's translated into English. You can even Google it and find a PDF and look at it as a short book if you want to flip through it. He then talks about how the pre-Islamic Arabs would go on this pilgrimage. And when they would leave Mecca, because they loved Mecca, they would take along as a memento some kind of a souvenir. They would pick up some sort of a rock, and then they would carve something. Then they would come back next time around, next Hajj season or next pilgrimage season. They would stick it in there. They would install it, as it were, in the Kaaba or in its vicinity. The Kaaba has an inside. It's a hollow. It's an empty, four-roomed, four-walled kind of structure with an empty room inside. And they also, under the influence of other peoples with whom they came in contact with, because they engaged in trade by traveling to Damascus, to Syria, which was a kind of metropolitan city center. It was the edge, as it were, of the Roman Empire in the east, which was known as Byzantium. The Arabs also were familiar with the ancient Sasanian Iranian Empire, or Sassanid Persia. There was also the remnants of whatever was left in Egypt, but that was very much Christian by that time, and it was thoroughly, especially Alexandria, was thoroughly Hellenized. It was a kind of Christianity which still survives to this day in Egypt, known as Coptic Christianity. It's a kind of Orthodox Christianity, so it's not Catholic, it's the Orthodox, like the Greek Orthodox, and they are also monophysites, meaning they believe in the one nature of the Christ. He's fully God, fully man. Anyhow, so this is the background. And so as a result of contact with these other people, they also often adopted other gods and deities and installed them in the Kaaba and around the Kaaba. And they gradually started assimilating certain other deities also to God. And they had this notion that God had daughters. And these daughters were named Al-Lat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza. And these three goddesses, the daughters of God, were highly venerated by the Arabs who actually resided at Mecca. So a community of people emerged at Mecca who just would hang around there and administer the pilgrimage, and they engaged in trade. And they were a number of different tribes who consolidated themselves into a tribal confederation known as the Quraysh. Quraysh, Quraysh. A lot of people think the Quraysh was a tribe and it's the tribe of the Prophet. That's not really true. It's a tribal confederation. It's a grouping of tribes who've banded together, and they've sort of divided up the privileges as well as the duties, because it's a two-edged sword of providing for the pilgrims who would come to Mecca. So they would provide them shelter and food, and hospitality was an extremely important pre-Islamic value and virtue, which was also glorified in the pre-Islamic poems. The most important and famous of these pre-Islamic poems are known either as the 7 Odes or the 10 Odes. Some people say there were 10, some people say there were 7 of the greatest poems of pre-Islamic Arabia, and they are called Al-Mu'allaqat in Arabic, which means the suspended odes. That's how it's usually translated. Suspended meaning hanging, because it is claimed, it's sort of a legendary claim, that they were written out in some way on some sort of brocaded, embroidered material and hung up, suspended. in the Kaaba. Some people dispute this story and say that this is merely an invention, a legendary account, and that the word mu'allaqat doesn't really mean suspended here, but it has the connotation or the sense of precious or something along those lines. Whatever the case may be, there's really no way to settle the issue. But it is a known fact that these 7 or 10 poems are extremely important, and they glorify these values as well, which I spoke of earlier, of the tribe, but also of generosity, of hospitality, of courage. So there was certain sort of sense of virtues that they had. At the same time, pre-Islamic Arabian society was an extremely divided society in many ways. There was slavery. There were people of color who were enslaved, who would come from Ethiopia, but it wasn't anything like you would have in America and the Deep South before the Civil War, because there were plenty of people of color, dark-skinned individuals, dark-pigmented individuals from Africa, who were not slaves. So there was economic disparity, there was exploitation, there was a tremendous amount of worldliness. The Arabs, they liked to drink. This was in contravention of laws instituted by Abraham. How did they drink? Well, they made wine out of fermented dates. There was also a tremendous amount of immorality, a kind of sexual debauchery and so forth, which also did prevail in Arabia. One of the most lamentable practices was that the birth of a daughter, especially as a firstborn child, was considered dishonorable. And there were people who were known to quietly take the female infant child out into the desert and quietly bury them alive. And that is a known practice, and it is denounced in the Quran. And it's interesting because the 3 goddesses, the 3 daughters of God, which the pre-Islamic Arabs spoke about, are also denounced in the Quran. And it says in that particular instance, I'm just paraphrasing, that, this is an unfair division. You guys basically are ashamed to have daughters, but then you turn around and ascribe daughters to God. Ascribing any kind of offspring to God is itself an abomination for Muslims. And so this is another interesting thing which you find there in the Quran, where this whole thing is denounced, the attitude toward daughters. Women, there were some very accomplished women in ancient Arabia, like the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad, Khadija, was someone who was her own woman, so to speak. She had her own, she had agency, she acted, she had her own very far-flung business. And so there were, it was nothing like the United States of America or Europe, obviously. But it wasn't a situation of complete and total, like women were just completely and totally not capable of doing anything. There were powerful women in Arabia. In remote pre-Islamic times, there was even a very famous pre-Islamic Arabian queen, in Greek sources referred to as Zenobia. Zenobia is this Greek form of the female name Zainab. Female Arabic name Zainab. And Zainab means the adornment of the father. It also means a kind of a beautiful tree, depending on which dictionary definition you like better. You'll find both in the Arabic lexicographical tradition. So this is a rough picture of the situation in pre-Islamic Arabia. Let me see what else is in this chapter. Yes, I've spoken about women. I've spoken about Mecca, the Quraysh, for the pre-Islamic Arabian historical tradition and their self-image, their remembered past, if you like. I mean, I'm not course, expecting you to believe this, but this is what is there in the tradition. And what is important, even for a secular historian, is this was the self-image of the Arabs at that time, on the eve of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. They saw themselves as the descendants of the Prophet Abraham. Yeah, there's this thing called the gifts of the Arabs. So maybe a little bit of on the Arabic language, I'll speak a little bit more. So the Arabic language is fundamental for the Islamic tradition because all of its important scripture is in Arabic, namely the Quran, its other religious texts, the Hadith. And the Quran is extremely important, even from a linguistic and broadly cultural point of view, in as much as it is really the first complete Arabic text to be preserved in the form of a book. The pre-Islamic poems weren't preserved in the form of a book. You know, there's this legendary account. I do think it's legendary that they were somehow embroidered on cloth, expensive cloth, and hung up. The pre-Islamic Arabs very much prided memory. Literacy was not common. There was no fully developed form of writing for the Arabic language that everybody agreed upon. There was a very rudimentary written form of the Arabic language, and very few people knew how to do it. And it was also very idiosyncratic, meaning it was very sort of personalized. So, I mean, look, if you want to have a written language that everybody can understand, you've got to have certain agreements. We have to agree on spelling, for example, for the most part. I know in English there's some differences between British spelling and American spelling, but, you know, it's not a big deal. But if everybody's just spelling any damn way they please, that's not going to work. And that's basically what you had. And it's not just spelling, it's the shape of the letters. So we have to have sort of a standardized shape, let's say the letter S, and you have to teach children to do that. You have to have education and literacy, and none of that existed. So there was a very rudimentary form of literacy at the time. And the pre-Islamic Arabic literature was preserved through memorization, through memory. And the Quran also initially was memorized. It wasn't written down until later and collected in the form of a book. There were copies made in the lifetime of the Prophet. Now, let me clarify what I mean by this. The Quran did not just come down all at once. It wasn't made public by the Prophet Muhammad all at once. It was revealed to him, as is believed by Muslims, piecemeal, in parts, over a period of 23 lunar years. And during that 23-year period, there were people who would copy down whatever portion had come down at the time, and it circulated in that kind of form, but again, only among people who could read. Again, that's very few. So most of these written forms, these little scraps which they wrote on, because there wasn't a lot of writing paper either. There wasn't really paper as we know it at all. It was really parchment or writings on flat stones or any sort of flat surface, including the shoulder blades of camels. So it's not until after that these materials were collected together and that you had a written document in the form of a book. So that's the first time that happens in the Arabic language. And in the subsequent centuries, the Arabic language developed all essentially in the service of the Quran and the understanding of the Quran. So as a result, it was a gradual process. It didn't happen overnight. So there was the emergence of a standard way of writing the Arabic language, standard letter shapes. Arabic calligraphy emerged. The science of Arabic grammar was codified. Various other additional, let's say, punctuation is not the right word, vowel marks, diacritical marks, dots. In other words, the visual representation of the sounds of the Arabic language was standardized. And the sciences that go with language, grammar, syntax, rhetoric, and indeed linguistics, all of these emerged out of the Quran. and the study of the Quran, the commentary on the Quran, and then by extension as well, the hadith. And so by the time that the Muslims establish a kind of world empire, Arabic really becomes the language of learning, because many works were translated from ancient Greek into Arabic via a language known as Syriac. And the people who took part in that usually were Nestorian Christians. Syriac is a language very close to Arabic. It was the language which, by all historical indications, Jesus would have spoken, because that was the language in Palestine. Syriac is also known as Aramaic. Aramaic is a more general term. These are linguistic niceties that I don't want to get into. Suffice it to say, what I'm telling you is accurate. There were also some Arab tribes who had accepted Christianity, like the Ghassan tribe, Bani Ghassan. And they may well also have been bilingual in Arabic and Syriac. On the eve of Islam, Syriac was really the lingua franca. It was like the common language throughout the Near East. It was understood in Sassanid Persia. It was understood throughout the whole sort of vast region of the Fertile Crescent. So the Arabic language is extremely important, and with these translations, everything started being written in Arabic. There were works in chemistry, physics, geometry, mathematics. The Arabs discovered or developed Arabized Muslims anyway. I mean, so many peoples entered Islam, and they used Arabic as their language. Algebra is an Arabic word. Trigonometry, as we know it today, in terms of the 6 trigonometric functions, both plane trigonometry and spherical trigonometry, wasn't really codified until Islam. There were elements of trigonometry that existed before, but the first fully developed text devoted to trigonometry was written in the 13th century, 1300s Christian, 7th century Hijra or Islamic calendar, by Nasiruddin al-Tusi, very important and accomplished scholar. Anyhow, so the Arabic language became a kind of world language until translations were made of many of these works, and they went to Europe via Latin translations. And of course, then things gradually changed and shifted. But the Arabic language was extremely important and remains extremely important for Islamic tradition. I think we'll stop this. We'll conclude the lecture here on this point, and then pick up with the discussion of the pre-Islamic Near East in the next lecture. Thank you very much for listening.